Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in to the She Can Ball podcast. I'm your host, Mahi Jariwala. Today, we're joined by Megan Roche, lead researcher at Stanford's Female Athlete Science and Transitional Research Program. Before we get into it, I want to thank Keto Crisp by Can Do for sponsoring today's episode. Keto Crisp protein bars only have 4 grams of carbs and 2 grams of sugar with 10 grams of protein. I keep these in my basketball and school bag because they make the perfect snack. What I love most about these bars is how good they taste. One of my favorite flavors is almond butter chocolate chip, and it literally tastes like a chocolate chip cookie. I'm an almond butter lover, so these bars just really hit home for me, but don't take my word for it. Try some yourself by going to tastecando.com and use code SheCanBall for 15% off your purchase. So before we get into the work that you do at FASTR, I kind of want to talk a little bit about your background because I know that you are a 6-time member of the USA track and field team, and then you ran track at the collegiate level as well. So where did you grow up and how did sports sort of impact you growing up?
Yeah, this is an amazing question. I feel like I have a lot of passion for athletics, and it started from a young age. I think I was always that like awkward kid. I didn't love birthday parties. I didn't love going to school, but for whatever reason, when I stepped on a soccer field, I felt like I found home. And it was the place where I just felt like I could like express myself and let out all of my like wild energy as a kid. So from the moment I stepped on a soccer field at age 4, I was hooked. I played soccer, lacrosse, basketball. I fell out of basketball a lot. That was my big problem with basketball is I would get 5 fouls within like 20 minutes of the game, and it was kind of a problem. And then actually, ultimately, the sport that I really focused on in high school was field hockey. And I didn't start playing though until 7th grade, and I just picked it up fast. I loved the pace of the game. I loved my teammates. And it reminded me a lot of soccer. It was kind of like a hybrid of soccer and lacrosse. And so I appreciated the sport. I actually went on to college. I went to Duke to play field hockey. And it was neat. I think being a college athlete made me realize that I wanted athletics to be some part of my life forever. It's really meaningful to have that time to get to compete with teammates, and that your teammates are your best friends and also people that you're going to class with. And so at that moment, I was like, whatever I do in my career, I want athletics to be a pivotal part of that. And then actually took a 5th year. So I loved running. And so that was something that was really important in my field hockey journey. And so I took a 5th year and walked onto the track team at Duke. I ran cross country and track, and transitioned from a power sport, which is field hockey, to an endurance sport, which is track. And in that process, learned a lot about human physiology and coaching and training.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy when I talk to a lot of guests on the podcast that go to these top tier schools and play athletics at this high level as well, because I think a lot of people struggle just going to these top tier universities and dwelling in academics. And, you were a neuroscience major, playing sports. I mean, how did you manage all of that?
It actually really helped me. So I was curious. So field hockey fall was our big season. We had, after like field hockey main season in the fall, we had like 2 to 3 weeks off in the winter before getting back into like winter training. And we had like a little bit of like a spring scrimmage season. And I found that that 2 to 3 week period of time off from field hockey, I just kind of felt unmoored. Like I didn't quite know like where to focus. And even though college sports are a big investment and big commitment time wise, for me, they were centering and grounding in a way that helped me as a student. So I always felt really off during those periods of time when our team was off. And I think just having the structure in college for me was really helpful. And then also too, I felt because I think field hockey, I had this built-in friend group. I had this like built-in community, and I was also pre-med at the same time. And the pre-med community can be a little bit intense. And so it was nice. I felt like I had these like dual communities that were very different. And it created for me this identity that was like multifaceted. And to me, that was really important. I think it helped me balance a lot of the tough times in college.
That's amazing. Yeah, because I feel like a lot of people do look at it as like, oh, a foot in sort of both doors, if you will, of trying to, do well in that pre-med sort of community, but also trying to do well in field hockey. But it's amazing that you were able to look at it from that point of view.
Yeah, I actually found, so for me, taking classes in the summer really helped. So I took organic chemistry in the summer, I took physics in the summer, like some of the really heavy classes. I was like, I just want to focus on this right now. And so I had good guidance in terms of like how I was structuring my pre-med classes and balancing that with sports and competition. And that was helpful. But I mean, certainly it was a really good balance that I needed. And I think when athletes are looking at schools, it's helpful to talk to athletes. It's helpful to talk to different advisors and just understand how, I mean, I think it's really school dependent, and Duke for me had a lot of resources to balance that pre-med life and to balance the athletic world. And so that was pretty paramount, but I don't think that's the case at every single school. And so I think in some extent I did get lucky.
And so, like, what sort of helped you make that transition from field hockey to then running track?
Yeah, that was wild. So I always loved running. I tended to be like, I loved wind sprints and was a little bit of a shorter distance runner. I actually competed in the 4x800 in high school. I would just kind of, when they needed someone to hop on the relay team, I would come from field hockey, having run very few miles and run a very painful 800 meters, which usually ended up like laying on the side of the track and being like, I didn't train for this, but I did run it. And so in college, once like junior year came around, I met my now husband and he was really big into running. And so I just started like tagging along on some of his runs. And because I'm a competitive person, it got faster and faster and faster. And that's when I knew, after racing a couple like local 5Ks, 10Ks, that it might be an option to hop onto the track team. And it was fun. Like, the track team and field hockey team were very different team cultures, and it was neat to get to experience that diversity of sport.
And like, how did you sort of get into that? Because I do want to put, because I know you do a lot of endurance stuff, and even with some work I'll play now. So like, how did you first get into that, and like, what were sort of your first steps, like endurance training and stuff? And how do you think that like your perspective now has like changed on like what you did then?
Yeah, so at first I had no methodology for my training. I would go out the door every day and kind of start hard, just run harder until I was really tired by the end of the run. And so I basically did that every day, which to some extent was mentally exhausting because every run was like moderate to moderate hard. And now these days, as an endurance athlete, there's a lot of variability in how I train my body. So like some days are very easy, some days are more hard, some days are long runs and moderate. And so it was interesting that what I first fell into was just going out the door and running hard. I actually remember talking to the Duke coach, and he was asking me about my training. And I was like, I really just run. And he looked at me like I was nuts. And it makes sense now that I'm in the coaching world, because it's a very non-traditional training methodology. But a big part of that for me was fun. I think I did carry some stress with me as like a pre-medical student. And so going out the door, and Duke had this beautiful, they call it the Duke Forest. And so I called it my forest time. I was like decompressing from classes, decompressing from the stress of meds, like pre-med sort of life, and just out there in the forest. And I think that connection to nature was so important to me, and was also, that's become something that's pivotal for me in trail and mountain running because of the nature of the terrain and the nature of the competition.
And do you ever think that in your life sports ever became sort of stressful? Because I know a lot of student athletes deal with that, where sports kind of becomes that stressor because there's so many factors that are involved in that. And, when that is sort of your escape or that sort of stress reliever, when that thing itself gets stressful as you're, moving through, going to play college and stuff, like, did that ever happen to you?
100%. I put so much pressure on myself as an athlete. And I look back at that actually with regret, because honestly, I remember very few exact moments in field hockey games right now. So looking back at this 12 years later, it's kind of this like amorphous memory. And the things that I remember are like things that are often surrounding the direct time playing in games, like time with teammates, or like time at practice, or like all these different things that aren't directly related to the exact metrics that I was evaluating myself at as a field hockey player. And so I went in my freshman year, I was pretty successful. I started my freshman year and was really thinking about like a path to the US Olympic team. And I actually really struggled in college. So I think unfortunately my freshman year might have been my strongest year as a field hockey player. And I think that's because I put so much pressure on myself, because I had the success as a freshman athlete. I was like, well, I have to be better as a sophomore. I have to be better as a junior. And it ultimately like ate me up and tore me apart to the point that I couldn't like think clearly on the field. And it was something that was very challenging. And I wish I could go back and just give Megan, the young field hockey player, a hug and say like, it's okay. This doesn't matter. Like, sports are so much more than stats. There's so much more than like X, Y, and Z accomplishments. But in my head, that was like all I was distilling it down to.
No, I think that's a reality for many kids. But I think it's important that girls just realize that, there's more to life than sports, and that like if it's becoming stressful, it's noticing that there's other outlets and there's other things you can do, because I think a lot of people sort of bank on it or just say like, oh, I really want to do this, I really want to do that, and they're kind of closed-minded in that sense. But it's knowing that there's other things, and I think it may be hard for you to realize that in the moment, but I think as you grow, things sort of fall into place.
Exactly. And I think for me, in the college environment, that's why having so many different identities, I was like a pre-med student, I was an athlete, I was a friend, I was all of these different things. And I think even though I was putting so much pressure on myself that it was still really challenging. I think these identities like helped me get through it, even though it might have been like really challenging for me. And I think that balance was just like so important. And I look back and I would have done things a lot differently. I would have been a lot kinder to myself.
Yeah, because I think so. Because I'm a sophomore now, so like coming in freshman year, I was super big on basketball, and I was like, totally want to do this. I was definitely looking to play like D3 or something, and I was like, I totally want to play high school, like college basketball, because I love this, and like, I want to do this all the time. And I put so much pressure on myself, and I feel like this off season was like the first time where I'm like, okay, you know what? It's okay. I'm just gonna go have fun. And like, I'm not going to worry about it at all. And I think there's so many other avenues that are opening up. And one of the most beautiful things I think with sports now is there's so many ways to stay involved. And I think that like right now in my life, I'm being exposed to so many different things that I can do to stay involved with sports without not necessarily playing it at a high level. And so I think that a lot of that stuff ends up just working out, just kind of give it time.
That's an incredible point. I just love your perspective. And I'm kind of in awe that you have that perspective as a sophomore in high school. It's like absolutely remarkable. So I think like big kudos to you on that. I think if I could go back, one thing actually that stands out in my mind on this topic is I think that when I was struggling myself and I recognized like my sophomore and junior year that I wasn't playing as well as I did my freshman year, I turned inwards and perhaps wasn't like right now as a coach, I feel like I'm a really supportive person and like hopefully like a pivotal and paramount person in a lot of people's lives. And I don't think, because I was so inwardly focused in college, I don't think I was necessarily as strong as a teammate as I could have been. And I look back on that with a lot of regret, because it's like, well, those are friendships that could have been more fully formed, or perhaps that's like a chance that I could have, given a teammate to uplift and boost someone, especially, underclassmen that were coming in. And so I think like the more you can also just embrace being a teammate and embrace, those other parts of sport, it just creates this like this really uplifting and rewarding element that goes beyond performance and goes beyond metrics.
Yeah, and you talked about coaching, running, and stuff, and then you also co-founded the Some Work All Play running group, and you even host their podcast. Like, what inspired you to get started with that?
Yeah, so I was in med school at the time, actually, when I started coaching, which is not a typically usual time to start coaching. My husband had launched Some Work I'll Play when I was in med school because I was doing work all the time, and he was like, I need something to do. And so he started coaching runners. And I ultimately became involved actually by coaching my mom and my sister. And I recognized just how fun it was, one, to get to design a training plan for someone. It's like it integrates a lot of things of training physiology and thinking about like psychology and balancing those two together. But I also love the human element of it. Like it was really fun to motivate my mom and my sister and to get to share those experiences. And so I just started gradually taking on more athletes. And then it got to the point by the end of med school where I was coaching a lot of athletes and coaching some elite athletes. And I think it became a key part of my identity and a part of something that I love doing. And I realized that, athletics are always going to be a roller coaster as an athlete, but as a coach, they'll also be a roller coaster too, but in a different way. And I want to be an athlete. I want to be involved in sports forever. And coaching is a great way to do that.
And what has it been to like host the podcast as well?
That's fun. It's actually, so my husband and I, we have a podcast, and we record it on Tuesday mornings, usually in our pajamas, like early in the morning. And it's just kind of like banter back and forth between us. And we call it our Tuesday morning date. And it's a time, at first I used to be nervous for the podcast because it was like, I'm putting myself out there for many thousands of people to listen to. And then it just became like him and I talking in the form of a date. And I think it's been a fun way. We break down training theory, we make jokes, we talk about like, important stuff, what we think is important, at least in the world. And I think it's just a really great time to have together, and also a time to learn research and to get to practice speaking and making bad jokes.
Yeah, no, because I think podcasting is very it's very informal, and that's what people like to listen to. They like to listen to fun conversations between people. And I think I definitely tried to put a lot of my pressure on myself, like, oh, I need to ask, like, well-rounded questions. I need to make sure that I'm doing a good job. But I think people in general, they want to be informed, but they want to have a good time, and they want to listen to you have a real conversation about these topics that are important.
Yeah, we keep it very real. I think we cut each other off. We swear from time to time. It's definitely kids should be aware of that before listening to it. So yeah, no, it's a really fun time. And also too, I do a lot of formal like scientific presentations, and I always used to get nervous for those. Like I think I wasn't like a very natural speaker, and the podcast has helped a ton in terms of like speaking ability, and also just being able to break things down informally has really helped with my formal presentations. And so it's interesting seeing, I mean, I imagine for you as a podcaster, like you'll see these skills translate into so many different areas of life, like whether it's like talking to someone and just having an authentic conversation or presenting formally. I feel like the skills really translate well.
Yeah, definitely. And then even like because you with your endurance coaching and stuff, like you know a lot about the body. Like, were you ever interested in learning like kinesiology or something in school, or did you kind of take classes on that?
Yeah, because I was always pre-med focused, I never quite had like the idea that I would go into like kinesiology or exercise physiology or one of like the related fields. But once I got into medicine, I recognized that medicine is a lot of understanding the physiology of what happens when things go wrong in the body. Because inherently these are patients coming in that have diseases or illnesses, or you're talking about preventing diseases. And it was in that process that I realized that I wanted to understand like what happens with high level physiology, like when things are like quote unquote going right. And so that's how I became, it's kind of like a backwards way of becoming interested in exercise physiology. And I still have never formally studied it, but between, studying medicine and having an MD, and then doing a PhD right now in epidemiology, I feel like the two have given me the foundation to read a ton of exercise physiology studies and be able to like incorporate that and synthesize that into the coaching that I do.
And then if I think I read it right, did you get a master's from business, right, at Duke?
Yeah, yeah. So that master's was interesting, actually. I was like all set to graduate. And then this is when I decided to walk on to the track team. And I walked onto the track team, had some success, and they were like, oh, you should stay on for a fifth year for a scholarship. And I was like, oh my gosh, but I was planning to graduate. What am I supposed to do? And so I wound up doing this master's program just kind of on a whim. So I could essentially run track. But it was a great way. I mean, I learned it's kind of like the first year of an MBA is how they describe it. And I got to learn a lot of things about business. And I have forgotten a lot of them in all honesty, but I think if I went back, they kind of like help at least me understand like what I don't know. And they form kind of just like a nice trajectory for thinking about, having a business or even like the stock market or different random things.
Yeah, and then can you talk a little bit about FASTR and the work that you do there?
Yeah, yeah. So really grateful to get to work with FASTR. So FASTR is the Female Athlete Science and Translational Research Program at Stanford. We're part of this larger, broader network of schools called the WUSI Human Performance Alliance that studies human performance and many different topics under human performance. The FASTR program at Stanford is directed by Dr. Emily Kraus, and she's also a physician in the Palo Alto and Stanford area. She works with a lot of young adolescent athletes, and we do research on female athletes. We know that there's a large gender gap in female athlete research. So female athletes are often not included in exercise physiology studies, often not included in sports science studies. And so we're working to address that, and also just working to translate the research too, because we know that sometimes when there's research studies, that research then doesn't go on to the hands of coaches and athletes and people who need to hear it.
And like, what are some interesting findings that you guys have had?
Yeah, so we're doing a study right now, actually, in high school athletes. It's called the FASTR pilot study. And we're putting together a 5-part educational video series. And we're working to, help athletes learn about mental health, bone health, menstrual cycle, nutrition and fueling, relative energy deficiency in sport, many topics that are highly relevant to young athletes. And so from that study, we're looking to see how athletes engage with the material and whether these videos, which prominently feature role models in sport, would be a productive way to communicate education in the future. And then we have a number of other, we've done work at the Western States Endurance Run, which is a 100-mile race. We've done a number of studies in the Pac-12 looking at bone health and bone stress injuries.
And like, are there any injuries that you're seeing that are like extremely prevalent with female athletes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So bone stress injuries we see a lot of, certainly more in sports like running, gymnastics, cheerleading, sports that tend to have a little bit more of like an aesthetic focus to them. Also see them in basketball quite a bit too. I think the pounding on the court, the different movement patterns in basketball can make for especially lower leg stress injuries, foot and tibia stress injuries. See a lot of sprained ankles in female athletes, also male athletes as well. And then ACL injuries. ACL injuries are actually increasing in female athletes. And, we're doing some research at FASTR to come that we still haven't fully fleshed out yet to look at ACL injuries.
And like, what are your recommendations for female athletes to sort of avoid these?
So it's really important prevention wise. Oftentimes, some of these injuries come from overuse. And I think for young adolescent female athletes, it's really important to take rest days, to take off seasons, to also prioritize playing different sports, especially like runners. It's great to have sports with multi-directional movement patterns like basketball, soccer, lacrosse, and just to fuel the body well. We know that bone stress injuries are associated with not getting enough energy availability. And so it's really important to fuel the body well, to sleep well, to treat the body like an elite athlete. And that becomes important for longevity in sport.
And like, you talk about just like taking rest days. I mean, what do you think would be like a good almost training regime for like a week of like an adolescent female athlete? Like, how many rest days do you think that they should be taking?
It really depends on the athlete. It depends what they're training for. It depends what type of sport they're doing. I think for a runner, 1 to 2 rest days is great. Certainly, you can potentially work in cross training on one of those rest days. For a ball sport player, I think 1 to 2 rest days is helpful. I think it's a combination of how the body is feeling and mental health as well too. Because I know sometimes as a young athlete, like going to practice 6 days a week can be a grind in combination with school, in combination with all these different things in life. And so, it really depends on the athlete, but also too, taking off seasons. I think taking 2 to 3 weeks after the main competition season, whether that's basketball, running, soccer, and using that as non-structured time to just relax, get in movement that you enjoy and not necessarily exercise. I think that can be really helpful and healthy.
Yeah, well, that's some really great advice, and I appreciate your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just so cool that you're doing this podcast and really honored to get to be on here and we got to chat beforehand and I'm excited for everything that you have ahead.